She had no idea why he stopped walking. She had stepped down from the wagon with dust on her dress and a warning on her lips, ready to tell this stranger exactly what she was and what she came with and why he might want to send her back. She had rehearsed that speech for 12 days on a train. She was ready to be rejected. What she was not ready for was the look on his face. He stopped. One full beat, one breath held and released, as if she were not a stranger at all, as if she were something he had been waiting for long enough that the waiting had become part of him, and the ending of it was almost too much to absorb standing still. She did not know yet that he had been watching for her for 3 years. She did not know that a summer morning in an Albany market had changed the entire direction of his life. She did not know that the family who had sent her away thinking they were disposing of a problem had, without knowing it, delivered her directly into the hands of the one man who had already decided she was worth finding. This is the story of Violet Whitmore, and it begins the way the best stories do, with a family's cruelty becoming against all their intentions the greatest gift they ever gave. The wagon stopped. The rear wheels had not yet settled when the dust came rolling forward, a slow amber curtain that swallowed the road behind and left nothing but open sky ahead. Violet Ann Whitmore sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not move for a long moment. She had been sitting in that same careful posture for 3 days. Straight spine, chin level, eyes forward. The posture of a woman who had decided before she ever left Albany that no one on this journey would watch her fall apart. She stepped down from the wagon onto Montana soil for the first time. The cold hit her immediately sharper than anything she had expected from an October afternoon. It was not the cold of New York winters, which were wet and gray and pressed against the skin like damp wool. This cold was clean and direct, like the land itself had no patience for pretense. It came down from the mountains to the north and moved through her traveling dress as if the fabric were not there at all. She breathed it in once slowly and let it settle. Then she looked up. The house stood at the end of a long approach road flanked by pine and cedar. It was bigger than she had imagined. Not grand in the way of Albany's merchant homes with their carved cornices and curtained windows, but large in the way of things built for purpose rather than impression. 2 stories of cedar timber, darkened by years of mountain weather, with a porch that ran the full length of the front. Behind the house, the land rose steeply into forested slopes, and behind the slopes rose the mountains themselves, their upper reaches already dusted with the first white of the season, gray and violet and vast in the afternoon light. She had to tilt her head back to find where they ended. She had read about the Rockies in the geography books her grandmother kept on the low shelf beside her bed. The books had not done the thing justice. 3 men stood on the porch. They were watching her, all 3 of them still and quiet, their faces unreadable at this distance. They were large men, she could tell that much, even from 60 yards. Large in the way that men become when they have spent years doing the work that land demands of those who would tame it. She could not yet read their expressions. She could only feel the weight of their attention. 3 separate lines of it converging on the woman stepping down from a hired wagon with a trunk, a leather satchel, and a silver locket at her throat. Violet reached up and closed her fingers around the locket for one moment. Her grandmother's voice came back to her clearly, the way it always did when she reached for it. Calloused hands are proof of living, not just existing. She looked down at her own hands for a count of 3. They were not delicate hands. They had never been. The knuckles were slightly rough, and the skin across her palms held the faint hardening that came from years of housework in a household where the woman who should have managed such things had long since decided that managing things was beneath her. She released the locket. She straightened her spine the last possible degree, and she walked toward the 3 men who were waiting. She did not yet know that the man on the left had been waiting for 3 years. But we should go back before we go forward, because the morning that made Violet Whitmore into the woman who stepped off that wagon had not begun in Montana. It had begun 12 days earlier in a parlor in Albany, New York, and it had begun as most of the worst mornings do, with laughter. The year was 1874. The house on Elm Street was a respectable house, narrow and white, with a small garden that Violet had learned to maintain before she was 15 because no one else in the family would. The parlor faced the street, and in the evenings when the lamp was lit, it threw warm light through the front window onto the brick sidewalk outside, suggesting a warmth inside that was mostly fiction. George Whitmore sat in the good chair that belonged to him by virtue of his being the head of the household. He was 54 years old and had the look of a man who had once been broader through the shoulders, the kind of man who had started strong and then spent 20 years standing in a slowly draining tub. He held a letter in both hands and he was reading it aloud with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has just solved a problem. The letter had come from Montana Territory, from a place called Cedar Ridge. Harriet sat across from him, her posture so correct it looked like discomfort. She was 50 years old and had spent the last 30 of those years perfecting the specific art of appearing pleasant while meaning something entirely different. Beside her on the settee, Constance, the eldest daughter at 25, wore an expression of polite curiosity that was already beginning to curl at the corners into something less polite. Dorothy, 22, sat nearest the lamp and did not bother with the pretense of curiosity at all. George read the letter through once and then set it down on his knee. 3 brothers, Cedar Ridge Station, Montana Territory. A cattle operation of substantial size. One of the brothers, the eldest, was seeking a wife through the Baptist Matrimonial Registry in Albany. The letter was careful and plainly written. It said the brothers were men of good standing and serious character. It said they were looking for a woman of genuine quality rather than fashionable appearance. It gave the name Caleb Harlow and asked that any interested party write back within the month. The registry had listed a Whitmore daughter 2 years prior when George had registered Violet without mentioning it to her in what he had described to himself at the time as a practical precaution. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then Harriet spoke. "Constance is engaged to Mr. Porter," she said. Her voice carried the careful melody of a woman delivering news she has rehearsed. "The wedding is in April, and Dorothy is still young." She paused just long enough. "But Violet would suit." What happened next was not malicious in the theatrical sense. There was no villainy in it, no mustache twisting or outright cruelty. It was something worse than that. It was the laughter of people who found the idea genuinely funny. Constance pressed her hand over her mouth and her shoulders shook. Dorothy made a bright, delighted sound and clapped twice quickly as a child does when something unexpected pleases her. George set the letter on the side table with the careful relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just found a place to set it down. 3 men on a mountain, he said. They'll be grateful for anything sent their way. He'll understand soon enough what he's taken on. Constance said, and she was not being unkind in her own estimation. She was simply being accurate as she saw it. Their problem now, Dorothy said, not ours. None of them looked toward the hallway. Violet was standing in the hallway. She had a stack of laundered bed linens in her arms folded and still warm from the iron. She had been carrying them upstairs when she heard her father's voice reading aloud, and she had stopped at the foot of the stairs because she had recognized a particular note in it. The note of relief, and she had learned long ago that her father's relief was rarely good news for her. She heard everything. She stood completely still, not because she was afraid of being discovered, but because the body does strange things when the mind absorbs something it already knew, but had chosen not to fully believe. She had known in the way that people who have been overlooked for long enough eventually know that her family did not consider her a permanent fixture in their household. She had known she was useful to them the way a good piece of furniture is useful without anyone feeling particularly attached to it. She had known that Constance's engagement had shifted the household arithmetic in some way that would not work out in her favor. But hearing it spoken in the lamplit parlor, while Constance laughed and Dorothy clapped and her father set the letter down with relief, that was different. Something cracked inside her chest very quietly, the way old wood cracks in cold weather. Not breaking, just giving way along a line that had been under pressure for a long time. She stood there until it stopped cracking, until the warmth had gone out of the linens against her arms and the cold from the front door had worked its way through the house and reached her where she stood. Then she set the linens down on the hallway bench. She pressed both palms flat against the plaster wall and held them there. The wall was cold. She breathed slowly and deliberately, the way she had taught herself to breathe during the years when breathing had to be a choice rather than a reflex. When she lifted her face from the wall, her expression had found its way back to the careful composure that 22 years in this house had made second nature. If they wanted her gone, then she would go. But she would go the way she chose, and she would arrive the way she chose, and not a single one of them would have the satisfaction of watching her break. She went upstairs. She carried the linens where they needed to go. And when she came back down, she knocked on the door of the small room at the back of the house where the air always smelled of dried lavender and old books and the particular warmth of a person who had lived long enough to make a room genuinely their own. Her grandmother was awake. Eleanor Whitmore, known all her life as Nell, was 76 years old and had been declining slowly for the better part of 2 years. The decline was in her body. Her mind remained exactly as it had always been, which was to say sharp, observant, and unbothered by the things that didn't deserve to be bothered about. She was sitting up against her pillows when Violet came in, and she had the look of someone who had been listening to the house. "Close the door," she said. Violet closed it. She sat in the chair that lived beside the bed and had lived there for as long as she could remember, positioned perfectly for exactly this kind of evening. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Nell looked at her granddaughter with the particular attention of someone who has spent decades watching a person grow and therefore sees not just what is in front of them, but everything that led to it. Then the old woman reached up and unfastened the silver locket at her throat. It was a small thing, oval, worn smooth at the edges from decades of handling. Nell opened it and held it toward the lamp so that the image inside caught the light. A woman young with a set to her jaw that was familiar. Not a painted portrait, but a small photograph, the kind made in the early days of the art, slightly blurred at the edges but clear enough in the face. "Your great-grandmother," Nell said. "Her name was Elspeth. She crossed the Appalachians in the autumn of 1810. 18 years old, no husband, no escort, and nobody's permission." She held the locket out to Violet. She did not ask. She decided, and then she went. Violet took it. The metal was warm from her grandmother's skin. "I don't know what I'm walking into," she said. It was not a complaint. It was information she was offering honestly, because honesty with Nell was the only mode the room permitted. "Elspeth didn't know either," the old woman said. "She went and she learned. That's all any of us can do." She settled back against her pillows with the careful economy of a woman managing a body that required more management than it used to. The women in this family are not made for small rooms and other people's permission slips. You never were Violet, not from the day you were born. The conversation did not go on much longer. Nell tired easily now, and Violet knew the shape of these evenings. But before she left, her grandmother held her hand one last time and says something that Violet would carry with her the whole long way to Montana. "When you get there," Nell said, "remember that you are not arriving as their charity case. You are not a problem being transferred. You are a woman of substance arriving on her own terms. Behave accordingly." Violet leaned down and pressed her forehead briefly against the old woman's. "I will write to you every week." "I know you will." She left. She went to her room. And there, instead of weeping, which the room seemed to expect of her, she sat at her small desk and made lists. This was the thing her family had never understood about her and had therefore dismissed as eccentricity. Violet Whitmore thought in lists. She thought it in inventories and assessments, in ordered sequences of practical action. When other young women in Albany were discussing the latest fashions from New York, she had spent 2 years reading agricultural pamphlets borrowed from the public lending library. When other daughters of comparable household were occupied with the social management of their futures, she had been quietly learning the geography of Montana Territory from a collection of survey reports that she had found in her father's study and which he had never looked at twice. She knew that Cedar Ridge sat at roughly 4,000 feet elevation. She knew the average first frost date and the average last. She knew the likely composition of the soil in the valley bottoms and the general behavior of mountain creeks in spring runoff season. She knew nothing about the men she was going to because there was nothing written down about them, but she knew something about the land, and the land was where she would have to make herself useful. She packed her grandmother's almond. She packed her books and her three most important books, the agricultural manual, the territorial geography, and a small medical reference volume she had purchased herself at the bookshop on Commerce Street, which she had spent the better part of 3 evenings memorizing. She set aside the dress her mother had laid out for her, a pale yellow thing with lace at the collar that had never suited her and would last approximately 1 day in ranch country before becoming unwearable. In its place, she packed the navy blue traveling dress that had been her grandmother's heavy fabric, well cut, built for someone who had somewhere real to go. She left a note on Nell's door the morning of her departure. It said, "I will write every week, and I will be all right, I promise." She meant both things. Now, while all of this was happening in Albany, something else was happening in Montana Territory. 6 days train ride to the northwest. Something that Violet did not know about and would not know about for several weeks yet. A fact that would, when she finally understood it, change the entire shape of the story she thought she had been living. The evening before the acceptance letter arrived from Albany, Caleb Harlow was standing on the porch of Cedar Ridge Station watching the last light leave the mountains. He was 36 years old and looked it in the way that men who have lived outdoors look their age, not worn down, but shaped by it the way stone is shaped by weather. He was broad through the chest and long in the arm, with hands that carried the particular history of 17 years of ranch work. The scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, a thin white line from a fence post accident when he was 23, had long since faded to something he no longer thought about. His hair was the dark brown of old cedar bark, and his eyes were the particular amber of whiskey, held up to firelight, steady and hard to read. He was a man of few words, not because he lacked thought, but because he had found over the course of 36 years that most words were not worth the breath they cost. The ones that were worth it, he chose carefully. He was holding a letter. It was from the Baptist Matrimonial Registry in Albany, New York, and it confirmed that the family of George Whitmore had a daughter available for consideration. The name at the bottom of the letter was written in a clerk's efficient hand, Miss Violet A. Whitmore, age 22. Caleb read the letter a second time. Then he folded it with the same care he gave to most things and held it in one hand while he looked out at the valley below. Cedar Ridge Station occupied a natural bench on the mountain's eastern flank, set back from the valley floor where the Cedar Ridge Creek wound through cottonwoods and willow. From the porch on a clear evening, you could see the full sweep of the valley, 3 miles of it, with the ridge line of the opposite mountains catching the last sun, while the valley floor below settled into shadow. Caleb had built the first structure on this land in the autumn of 1857, a single-room cabin that had barely kept them alive through the first winter. He was 19 years old that winter, and his brothers were 15 and 12, and all three of them had understood in the wordless way that children understand necessity, that there was no one coming to help. That had been 17 years ago. The single-room cabin was gone now, replaced by the 2-story cedar house behind him, solid enough to last another century if someone kept the roof sound. The land around it was worked land now, fenced and grazed and watered, with a proper barn and a second structure for the hands, and a root cellar that could keep a household through the deepest winter the mountains could produce. 1,200 acres held within a boundary he had ridden himself, measured and filed, and defended, sometimes with paperwork and sometimes with the particular clarity that came when men on horseback understood each other's intentions. He had built all of it, he and his brothers, with help from the hands he had taken on over the years, but the architecture of it, the decisions in the direction, those had been his. Every fence post and every water channel and every decision about which fields to graze in which season had come from the same place, from the 17-year-old who had looked at a broken-down cabin and a dead father's deed and decided that giving up was not an option. He had been good at that, at deciding. What he had not been good at, it turned out, was deciding what he needed for himself rather than for the ranch. He stood on the porch with the letter in his hand and let himself think carefully and honestly about why he had written to the Albany Registry in the first place. The practical reasons were easy enough to name. The ranch had reached a size and a level of complexity that one man could not manage alone, not in the way a home needed managing, not the thousand small competencies that kept a household running through the seasons. The hands were reliable men, but they were hands, not family. Winifred Alcott had been with them 6 years and kept the house with a thoroughness that brooked no argument, but she was not family either, and everyone understood that. But the practical reasons were not, he knew the real reason. 3 years ago, in the summer of 1871, Caleb had ridden to Albany on a cattle buying trip. He had spent 4 days there concluding a purchase of 12 horses from a breeder outside the city, and on his second morning, he had walked through the commercial district to a place called Merchant Row to look for a particular grade of hemp rope that his regular supplier in Billings had stopped stocking. He had been halfway down the row when he heard the argument. It was the kind of argument that draws a crowd in a public market loud enough to stop people but not yet loud enough to make them act. A merchant had accused an elderly peddler of stealing from his display while the peddler's back was turned. The peddler, a small, white-haired man with a cart of tinware, was denying it with the stammering desperation of someone who knows they are not going to be believed. The merchant was loud and certain in the way that loud, certain men in public markets are when they have an audience. The crowd was doing what crowds do, watching. Then a young woman walked into the middle of it. She was not tall. She was not striking in any obvious way. She had honey-colored hair pinned up practically beneath a plain hat, and she was wearing a dress that was well-made but not fashionable, and she had a basket over one arm from which she had apparently been shopping. She set the basket down on the nearest stall table without looking at what she was setting it on, and she walked directly between the merchant and the old man, and she began to speak. She did not shout. She did not appeal to the crowd or perform for it. She spoke directly to the merchant calmly and precisely in the tone of a woman who had thought this through and arrived at her conclusions before she opened her mouth. She described what she had seen from 20 yards away, the sequence of events, who had been where and when. She was specific about the timing. She named the 2 other market vendors who had been facing the same direction she had. She said that if the merchant wanted to continue this conversation in front of witnesses who had seen the same thing she had, she was willing to wait. The merchant backed down. Not gracefully, not without a great deal of muttering and misdirection, but he backed down. The young woman reached into her basket then and found her coin purse and took out enough to cover what the peddler had lost in the confusion. She handed it to the old man without comment, picked up her basket, and walked away through the market as if none of it had required particular courage. Caleb had been standing at the back of the crowd the whole time. He had not moved. He had watched a girl not yet out of her 20s do something that he, a man of 33, who had ridden these mountains his whole adult life, had stood by and failed to do first. He was not a man who easily experienced shame, but he experienced it then, a quick, specific burn, and alongside it something that surprised him more, a recognition deep and certain that whatever he had just watched was the rarest thing he had seen in a long time. He asked a nearby stall keeper for her name. The man shrugged and pointed to a vendor 2 stalls down who knew everyone on the row. That vendor knew the Whitmore family. Violet Whitmore, George Whitmore's second daughter. Elm Street. He had not tried to find her. He had no legitimate reason to seek out an unmarried woman in a city where he was a stranger, and he was not a man who acted without legitimate reason. But he had not forgotten her face, and he had not forgotten the particular quality of her steadiness. In that moment, the sense of someone who had done the internal work before the external moment required it. 3 years later, sitting with a letter from the Albany Registry in his hand, and the ranch settling into autumn silence around him, he had thought of that face before he had thought of anything else. He did not know which of George Whitmore's daughters had been registered. He had found the registry listing through a circuit preacher who had passed through Cedar Ridge in the spring, and the listing gave only the family name. It was possible he knew that the woman being offered was not the one he had seen at Merchant Row. It was possible they would send him someone entirely different. He found to his own mild surprise that he had thought about what he would do in that case. And what he had concluded was the same thing he always concluded when the variables of a situation were outside his control. He would meet what came with the same care and good faith he would bring to anything else. He would not be unjust to a woman who had done nothing to deserve injustice. But he hoped. He folded the letter a second time and tucked it into his shirt pocket and went inside. Behind him at the kitchen table, his youngest brother was sharpening a belt knife with the slow, methodical attention he gave to anything that required precision. Sterling Harlow was 29 years old and had been born with more edges than most people needed. He was not mean, not in any fundamental sense, but he was sharp in the way that certain environments produce sharpness, the way a winter on that mountain produces a specific quality in the men who survive it. He looked up when Caleb came in. He had the amber eyes that ran in the family pale as mountain honey, and they were currently carrying the particular weight of a question he had already decided to ask. "You heard back," Sterling said. It was not a question. The registry confirmed a Whitmore daughter. Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the stove with it. "She arrives in 12 days if she takes the train we suggested." Sterling set the knife and the whetstone down side by side. "You don't know which one?" "No." A silence stretched between them that was not uncomfortable because they had been having this particular conversation for months, ever since Caleb had told his brothers what he intended to do and why. Sterling had listened to the why with the careful attention he gave to most things and had then said very quietly that he hoped Caleb knew what he was asking for. Caleb had known what Sterling meant. They had both known. The memory of it was still present in the house 5 years later, a particular kind of absence that had never quite filled in. "What if it's not her?" Sterling said. Caleb looked out the window at the mountains going dark against the sky. "Then we will be fair to whoever comes, and we will learn who she is." He turned back to the room. "That's the only honest answer I have." Sterling looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he picked up the knife again and returned to sharpening it. "All right," he said. Down the hall, Broderick Harlow, the middle brother at 32, appeared in the kitchen doorway with the easy, unhurried manner that distinguished him from both his brothers. Where Caleb was a man of settled weight and Sterling was a blade, Broderick was something more like the current in a river always moving, never forceful, working around obstacles rather than through them. He had the darkest blonde hair of the three and eyes more gray than amber, and he had the gift rare in men than it should be of making whoever he was talking to feel that what they were saying was genuinely worth hearing. He had been listening from the hallway. 12 days, he said. 12 days, Caleb confirmed. Broderick poured himself the last of the coffee and leaned in the doorway with it, looking between his brothers with an expression that was impossible to read except by people who had grown up reading it, and those people would have recognized it as the expression of a man who was quietly, carefully hoping for the best. "Then I suppose," he said, "we should get the east bedroom aired out." That night, Caleb sat at the table after his brothers had gone to bed and wrote in the ledger he kept, not the ranch account, but the other one, the one that held the running record of decisions and observations he had been keeping since his first year on the mountain. He did not write much. He wrote, "The woman comes from Albany. I believe I know her. We will see." He closed the ledger. He put it in the desk drawer and turned the small brass key. Through the window, the lamp threw its reflection against the dark glass, and beyond the reflection, the mountain was a presence more felt than seen, the same mass of rock and pine and altitude that had been there every night for 17 years. It asked nothing of him. It offered nothing back. But it did not leave, and he had come to understand that the mountain's version of faithfulness was simply its continued presence, and he had always considered that sufficient. 12 days later, the wagon came down the approach road with a trunk roped to the back and a young woman sitting in the bed of it with her spine perfectly straight and her hands folded in her lap, and Caleb Harlow stepped off the porch of the house he had built with his own hands and walked toward her across the packed dirt, and the moment he saw her face clearly, he stopped. One full beat, one breath held and released. It was her. Violet Whitmore stepped down from the wagon and her boots touched Montana soil for the first time. And she looked at the mountains behind the house, and then she looked at the three men in front of her, and she straightened the last possible degree, and she walked forward. She stopped a few feet away. She looked at the man who had stepped forward, the one with the amber eyes and the jaw with its thin old scar, and something moved across her face that she could not have named, a flicker of the inexplicable, a sense of something almost remembered. She said, "I should tell you something before we go any further. My family sent me here because they wanted to be rid of me. I speak plainly when it would be more comfortable to stay silent. I notice things people would rather not have noticed, and my hands are calloused, which my mother considers a deficiency of character." She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has decided before arriving that she will not pretend to be anything other than what she is. "If any of that is a problem for you, better to say so now." The silence that followed lasted long enough to matter. Then Caleb Harlow spoke. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who does not waste words. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "that is exactly the reason I wrote to Albany." She looked at him for a moment, really looked the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. And somewhere behind the careful composure of a woman who had traveled 12 days and arrived, determined not to be afraid, something shifted, not dramatically, just a fraction, the way a door shifts when a draft finds the crack under it. She did not know yet what he had seen 3 years ago. She did not know that the letter her father had answered with gleeful speed had been written for her specifically. She did not know that the man standing in front of her had been carrying her face in his memory since a summer morning in a market called Merchant Row, where he had watched her do something he had been too slow to do himself. She did not know that the hope he had carried through 3 years of not knowing was as of this moment exactly as large as he had let himself allow. She knew only what she could see. A man who had looked at her warning list of flaws and found them satisfactory. A porch, a mountain, a place that had been built with 17 years of deliberate, unresting work, and a feeling quiet and entirely unlooked for that she had arrived somewhere that had not finished with her yet. The arrangement was laid out that first evening at supper, and it was laid out the way Caleb Harlow did most things directly, without decoration, with no particular effort to soften it into something easier to receive. The kitchen was the heart of the house, large and warm, with a table that could seat 8 and usually seated 4. A cast iron stove occupied the far wall and had been burning since before Violet arrived, filling the room with the particular warmth that only a good wood fire produces, dry and clean, with a faint smell of pine in it. Winifred Alcott, who had been managing this kitchen for 6 years and had opinions about how it was managed, had left a pot of stew on the stove and a pan of cornbread on the side table, and had then retreated to her own room with the air of a woman who had prepared the stage and had no intention of performing on it. The four of them sat down. Caleb spoke first, as he always did when there was something practical to be established. He had the quality of men who have been making decisions alone for a long time, a certain evenness in the delivery, the same tone used for planting schedules and land assessments and any other matter that required clarity above comfort. He told her that the east bedroom was hers and would remain so. He himself would take the storeroom off the barn until such time as both of them agreed otherwise. There would be no legal arrangement filed until both of them were willing. They would take several weeks to know each other honestly, to understand what this ranch required and whether she was inclined to provide it, and then they would decide together whether to proceed. He said the words "decide together" without emphasis, as if they were simply accurate rather than generous, which Violet thought it said more about him than any quantity of formal courtesy would have. She listened to all of this with the careful attention she gave to anything that would determine the next several years of her life. When he finished, she said, "I accept those terms, and I would like to see the ranch ledgers." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Broderick, who had been watching her with the attentive warmth of someone encountering a new and interesting variety of weather, set his coffee cup down with a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. Sterling, to her left, placed his fork on the edge of his plate with the deliberate precision of a man cataloging information and looked at her without expression. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll have them on the desk in the morning." That was the first evening. She lay in the east bedroom that night and listened to the sound of Montana at midnight, which was completely unlike the sound of Albany at midnight. Albany at midnight carried the low, continuous murmur of a city talking to itself, cartwheels on cobblestone, 3 streets over, voices from the tavern on the corner, the creak of the neighbor's sign in the wind. Montana at midnight was a different animal entirely. The silence here was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and patient. The mountains breathing in the dark, the wind moving through pine and cedar with a low, steady note that had no city equivalent. The occasional distant sound of cattle settling in the lower pasture. She lay with her eyes open and thought about the 3 men she had met today. The first man had looked at her and stopped walking. She had seen it. She had not understood. It could not yet account for the quality of recognition in it, but she had filed it away with the precision she gave to everything that did not yet have an explanation. He was a man of settled authority, the kind that does not need to assert itself because it has long since become structural, the way a low-bearing wall is authoritative. He moved through his own house the way the mountains move through the landscape, simply there, simply necessary. The second man, Broderick, had the quality of still water over a complicated bottom. He was warm in a way that was genuine rather than performed, and he watched her with an interest that was thoughtful rather than evaluative. She did not yet know what he was thinking behind that careful warmth, but she understood that there was more there than the easy friendliness suggested. The third man, Sterling. He watched her the way a trained eye watches the horizon in changing weather, not hostile, not curious in any ordinary sense, but calibrated for the specific purpose of detecting incoming threats. She did not know yet why, but she filed that too. 3 people, each different. One had chosen her for a reason she did not yet fully understand. One was waiting to see what she would do. One was waiting for her to fail. She would start with the only things she knew how to start with. She would make herself useful. She was up before dawn. The house was still dark when she rose and dressed and let herself quietly out the side door, taking one of the lanterns from the hook in the mudroom. The cold met her immediately harder than the previous afternoon, with a weight to it that suggested the season was not offering a gradual transition. October in Montana territory was not a gentle month. She had known this from the reading. The body learning it was a different matter. She walked the ranch in the gray light before sunrise, lantern in one hand, and the small notebook she carried everywhere in the other. She had begun keeping this notebook 2 years ago when she first understood that she was likely to be sent somewhere and had started preparing for that somewhere with the only tools available to her, her mind and her time, and the lending library on Jefferson Street. The barn first, sound construction, cedar framing the roof tight, except for one section above the northwest corner where she could see, even in the pre-dawn light, the faint discoloration that indicated a slow leak. Not urgent, but worth addressing before the deep freeze of November settled in. The fencing along the eastern pasture ran long and mostly straight, but had a section of perhaps 40 yards near the creek junction where the posts had settled unevenly, leaving gaps between the rails that a determined calf could have exploited. She noted the approximate footage of replacement rail that would be needed. The water problem was the most significant thing she found. She had noticed it from the wagon the previous afternoon and had not been certain enough to mention it then, but the morning light confirmed it. The main water channel on the eastern pasture, which drew from the creek above and distributed to the troughs in a system of wood-lined ditches, had a blockage somewhere in the upper section. The result was visible in the ground, a spreading wet patch where water was overflowing the channel wall, and beyond it, in a ring of perhaps 8 or 9 yards diameter, the particular dull color of grass that has been drowned rather than watered. She stood over it for a few minutes, tracing the logic of the system, with her eyes finding where the overflow began and working backward to where the pressure would have been building. She wrote it all in the notebook. She drew the channel layout from memory and marked the probable location of the blockage with an X. By the time she came back inside, the kitchen was warm, and the smell of wood smoke had mixed with the smell of coffee, and Winifred Alcott was standing at the stove with the expression of a woman who had heard the side door open before sunrise and had revised her opinion accordingly in a direction she was not yet prepared to announce. The three brothers arrived at the table in the order that apparently reflected some long-established household habit. Caleb first, then Broderick, then Sterling, the last still pulling his suspenders straight, with the look of a man who considers the necessity of breakfast a minor inconvenience in an otherwise practical schedule. Violet placed the open notebook in the center of the table beside the pan of cornbread. 7 items, ordered by priority, each with a brief description of the problem and a note on the materials likely needed from the existing stock she had observed in the barn. The water channel was listed first. Caleb picked it up. He read it in the particular silence of a man reading something he is taking seriously. Broderick leaned over from his chair and read alongside him. Sterling did not move toward the notebook, but she noticed that his eyes went to Caleb's face and tracked the reading there, which told her something about how information moved in this household. Caleb set it down. He looked at her across the table. "What time did you go out?" "5 o'clock." Broderick made the sound again, the one that lived in the territory between a laugh and something more genuine than a laugh. Sterling was quiet for another 10 seconds. Then he stood up from the table and said without looking at her, "I'll get the copper pipe from the storage shed." He walked out. The side door closed behind him. It was the first voluntary act Sterling Harlow had performed in relation to her since she arrived. She understood it for what it was, not warmth, not acceptance, but the grudging acknowledgement that the notebook existed and was not wrong. She and Caleb went out to the eastern pasture after breakfast. The work was straightforward once the blockage was located, a buildup of silt and debris at the channel junction that had been accumulating for at least a season, possibly longer. Caleb cleared it with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done every kind of physical labor this land requires and carries the knowledge of it in his hands. She showed him the proposed rerouting, a simple adjustment of the outflow angle that would prevent the same accumulation from building again using the copper pipe Sterling had left by the channel entrance. They worked mostly without speaking, which she found easier than she expected. The silence between them had a quality she had not encountered before, not uncomfortable, not weighted with things unsaid, but functional. The silence of two people engaged in a shared task who do not need words to coordinate. When the water was flowing correctly, Caleb stood at the edge of the field and looked at the ring of dead grass. He was quiet for a moment. "Years," he said. "I've been looking at that ring for years." "You've been busy," she said. "People who carry everything themselves don't always see the small things." He turned and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not the look she was accustomed to receiving from men who had assessed her and found her satisfactory or unsatisfactory according to the usual measures. It was something more specific than that, more particular to her, rather than to the category she occupied. She filed it with the other things she had not yet found explanations for. In the afternoon, Sterling came to find her by the fence line and taught her the knot. It was called a stockman's tie, he said, without elaboration, and it was used for securing cattle in high winds when ordinary hitching would not hold. He demonstrated it once, his large hands moving through the sequence with the automatic ease of 10,000 repetitions, and then he handed her the rope. She made the knot wrong the first time and correctly the second. Her hands, which had been told for 22 years that they were too rough, too callous, too unladylike for any desirable purpose, turned out to be suited for rope work in a way that softer hands would not have been. The friction grip was better. The knot held harder. Sterling looked at her hands when she finished the second knot. His expression did not change, but something in it shifted the way a stone shifts when a current moves under it. Not visibly, but detectably if you were paying attention. He did not say anything. But he did not leave immediately either. He stood with her by the fence for a few minutes and pointed out two other sections that would need attention before the first serious freeze showed her the specific kind of sagging that meant the post had rotted at the base versus the kind that meant the wire had simply stretched. Practical information delivered practically with no warmth in it, but no coldness either. It was more than he had offered the day before. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table after supper and showed Broderick how to read a contour map. It turned out a quick study. He had the kind of spatial intelligence that people carry without knowing they have it until something gives it a framework. And once she explained the logic of contour lines, how the spacing told you the slope and the shape told you the drainage, he began to see the map as a landscape rather than a drawing and ask questions that were genuinely intelligent. They were still at it when Winifred came back through the kitchen to put the bread in the crock for the night. She stopped for a moment in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room and looked at the two of them at the table with the map between them and said nothing, absolutely nothing, and moved on. But the following afternoon, on the third day, she came into the kitchen while Violet was beginning the preparations for supper and set a clean apron on the corner of the work table without a word. Violet picked it up and put it on. They stood side by side at the stove and cooked the evening meal in a silence that was not companionable in any demonstrative way, but had the quality of two women who have independently decided that working together is more efficient than working separately and have accepted that conclusion without needing to discuss it. It was the only acknowledgement Winifred Alcott would make ever that she had changed her mind. But it was enough. The eighth morning came with a frost that silvered the ground from the porch rail to the tree line, and Broderick found her in the kitchen garden where she had been examining the cold damage patterns on the late squash. He stood at the garden gate for a moment. He had the look of a man who has decided to say something and is choosing the moment rather than the words, since the words were already chosen. "There's something you should know," he said. She set down the squash and waited. He told it plainly without apology for the telling, but also without cruelty. 5 years ago in 1869, Caleb had corresponded for several months with a woman in St. Louis through a different matrimonial service. He had been careful with it, methodical in the way he was with most things, writing letters that were honest about the life here, describing the winters and the isolation and the work accurately rather than attractively. The woman had written back, and her letters had been warm and specific, and Caleb had, in the way of a man who does not do things by halves, begun to trust the correspondence. She had arrived in October. Her name was Marguerite. She had stayed 1 week. The house, she said, was not what she had pictured. The winters were beyond what any letter could have adequately warned her about. The distance from civilization, which Caleb had described honestly and she had read as an exaggeration, was not an exaggeration. She had left a note on the kitchen table before 4 in the morning and was on the first southbound stage before the household was awake. Caleb had not spoken her name afterward. He had not changed anything in the house to mark that she had been there. He had eaten his supper at the same time and in the same chair for the year that followed, and if it cost him something to do, the cost was internal, and the bill was paid alone in the barn, in the fields, in the places where a man can be private about what he is carrying. Sterling had been 24 years old. He watched the lamp in Caleb's room go off later and later every night that winter. Broderick said, "I think it was the first time he understood what loneliness could do to a person who was too proud to name it." Violet stood in the frost-whitened garden and looked at the mountains. "And so Sterling decided," she said. "Sterling decided he would not let it happen again." Broderick's voice was measured, not asking for her sympathy, simply completing a picture she needed to have in order to understand what she was looking at every day. "He doesn't dislike you, Miss Whitmore. He doesn't know you well enough to dislike you. What he's doing is watching for the moment you leave. He's been watching for it since the wagon came down the road." She was quiet for a moment that was longer than most people would have held. "I understand," she said. "What will you do with it?" "Nothing," as she said. "I'll just understand it." She bent back to the squash. "Thank you for telling me." He watched her for another moment. Then he pushed off the fence post and went back toward the barn, And she stayed in the garden with the frost and the information and the quiet understanding that Sterling Harlow's coldness had never been about her. It was about a piece of paper left on a kitchen table in October 5 years ago, and a man who had eaten supper alone for a year and never once made anyone else pay for it. She thought she understood that kind of wound. She had been carrying a version of her own for 22 years. The 12th day arrived with the particular quiet of a house where something significant is already in motion before anyone has spoken about it. She was in the garden again when she heard the side door of the house open and close, with a particular quiet that was different from the ordinary traffic of a working household. Through the kitchen window, she could see Caleb at the table, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that she had not seen in 12 days of watching him. She went inside. He was standing with a letter in his hands. He had already read it, she could tell, and had folded it closed again. He looked up when she came in. "Your family," he said, "did they want you to come here?" She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, then she walked to the table and sat down across from him. She told him the truth, all of it without softening, without the managed version she had been carrying since Albany, the parlor on Elm Street. Her father's face when he read the registry letter, the specific quality of relief in it. Her mother's voice saying her name in the tone that had always meant the problem has been solved. Constance pressing her hand over her mouth while her shoulders shook. Dorothy clapping twice quick and bright. Their problem now, not ours. She told him about standing in the hallway with the laundered linens going cold in her arms, listening to herself be disposed of in the language of relief and inconvenience. She told him about her grandmother's room and the locket and the woman named Elspeth who had crossed the Appalachians without anyone's permission. She told him about the note she had left on the door. She did not cry. But when she said her grandmother's name, something in her voice bent slightly, the way a branch bends in wind, and she paused long enough to straighten it before she continued. When she had finished, Caleb unfolded the letter and held it across the table. She took it. She read it once. Then she read it again slowly, the way she read things she intended to understand completely. It was from Constance. It had been sent to Caleb's, aimed directly bypassing her, and it was written in the careful, pleasant handwriting of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. It said that Violet had a history of causing disruption in the family, that she inserted herself into matters that were not her concern, that she sowed discord with her habit of speaking when silence would have served better, that their father had sent her in good faith, but that she, Constance, felt compelled by sisterly duty to warn Mr. Harlow that he might find the arrangement more challenging than anticipated. Every sentence was technically accurate about something real and entirely dishonest about what it meant. Violet folded the letter. She folded it very precisely, crease against crease, the way she folded things she intended to handle without giving away what they cost her. She set it on the table between them. "What will you do with it?" she asked. Caleb looked at her across the table for a long time, long enough that it became a decision rather than a pause. "Nothing," he said, "because I know who you are. I knew it before you arrived. Your sister's opinion of you is not information I was lacking. It is simply wrong." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "And I think it is time you called me Caleb." She looked at him. There was something in that sentence, in the plain weight of it, the simple assertion that her sister was wrong, and that the assertion required no elaboration or defense, that landed somewhere in her chest with a force entirely disproportionate to its length. No one in her life had ever said that to her, not in those exact terms, not without qualification. She said carefully, "All right, Caleb." He nodded once. He picked up the letter and put it in the stove. They did not discuss it further. That evening, the household had the particular quality of a space in which something has shifted without any visible event to account for the shift. Broderick noticed it and said nothing, which was his way of acknowledging it. Sterling noticed it and set his jaw slightly, which was his way of reserving judgment. Winifred brought an extra dish to the table that she had not announced and poured an extra measure of coffee without being asked, which was as close as she came to celebration. The 15th evening arrived with the darkness coming early now, and the fire built higher to compensate and Violet brought the supply ledger to the table after supper and laid it open to the section she had been reviewing. She had noticed it 3 days earlier. Not a theft in the dramatic sense, not cash money missing from a lockbox, but the slow and careful diminishment of stockroom supplies in a pattern too consistent to be waste. Flour and salt and oats and dried beans in amounts small enough to escape casual attention, but large enough over 17 months of accumulated evidence to add up to something significant. The pattern had started in May of the previous year, which was 17 months before she arrived. She put this last fact plainly before she said anything else. The dates were visible in the ledger. The timeline was unambiguous. Caleb looked at the entries. Broderick looked over his shoulder. Sterling sat very still. Then Sterling said, "How do we know you're not the one who noticed it because you're the one doing it?" The room went quiet in a specific way. Broderick turned his head toward his younger brother with an expression that was a clear instruction and an equally clear prediction that the instruction would not be followed. Violet held Sterling's gaze. He had pale amber eyes that were difficult to hold, not because they were unfriendly, but because they were very precise, and precision is uncomfortable when you are the subject of it. She said, "You don't know. That is the correct question. Here is how you check it." She turned the ledger and pushed it toward him, keeping her finger on the relevant page. "The discrepancy starts in May of last year. I arrived 3 weeks ago. If you look at the dates, you can verify that the pattern predates my presence by 17 months. I can give you the name I suspect, but you should verify it through your own means and not take my word for it. I would rather you trust the evidence than trust me. You don't know me well enough to trust me yet." Sterling was quiet for a measured amount of time. Then he said, "Garrett Fowler." She nodded. "That is the name I was going to say." Garrett Fowler was the fourth handyman who had been with the ranch for 2 years and had the particular manner of someone who had learned to make himself unremarkable in order to remain unexamined. Caleb confronted him the following morning with a ledger and a short, precise accounting of the discrepancies. Fowler did not deny it at length. He was gone before noon, his wages settled to the date of discovery, and not 1 day further, which was Caleb's version of mercy, applied to the situation. The house felt different after he left. Not lighter exactly, but cleaner in some specific sense, the way a room feels after a window has been opened. That afternoon, Sterling passed Violet in the hallway between the dining room and the kitchen. He stopped. He did not turn around. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and then he said, addressing the wall in front of him, "You answered that well." Then he walked on. She stood in the hallway a moment after he was gone. She did not smile. She was not the kind of woman who performed emotional responses for the benefit of an empty hallway. But she felt clearly and quietly the specific satisfaction of a lock that has turned after a long effort. The town of Cedar Ridge sat in the valley below the ranch like a sentence that had not yet decided how it wanted to end. 3 weeks after Violet arrived, when the first hard frost had come and gone, and the mountains had taken on the particular gravity of a place preparing for serious winter, Caleb told her at breakfast that they needed to go into town for supplies. Broderick was already at the door with his hat on. Sterling said nothing but appeared at the horses with a cinched strap over his shoulder before anyone had finished their coffee. Cedar Ridge was a 30-minute ride down the valley road, and it was a town that gave you its measure in the first few minutes. One main street straight and practical with a hardware store and a general provisions merchant and a land office and a church at the eastern end, its whitewash fresh enough to still smell of lime in the October air. There was a school, a small one and a farrier's, and a building that called itself the Cedar Ridge Commercial Hotel, but whose primary business appeared to be the saloon that occupied its ground floor. People looked at Violet. She was accustomed to being looked at in Albany, but the manner of it was different there, the practiced disinterest of a city that has seen every variety of person and feels obligated to pretend indifference. Here, the attention was direct and unashamed, the attention of a small community that receives genuine news infrequently and does not waste it when it arrives. By the time she walked through the door of Hargrove's General Provisions, her name and her origin and her approximate purpose were known to every person on that street. She was examining the quality of the dried beanstalk when the woman arrived. Lavinia Marsh had the quality of a room that has been arranged to appear effortless. Everything about her was correct in the way that requires considerable effort to produce, from the set of her collar to the precise positioning of her smile. She was 40 years old and had come originally from Virginia, which meant she carried in her bearing the particular confidence of someone who had been raised to believe that social authority was a birthright rather than an acquisition, and who had spent 20 years on the Montana frontier without relinquishing that belief by a single degree. She introduced herself with warmth that was technically genuine in every element and entirely calculated in its application. She said how lovely it was to finally meet Miss Whitmore. She said that Cedar Ridge was so pleased to have new energy at the station. She said the Harlow men were such pillars of the community, really the very backbone of the valley. And then, with the smooth inevitability of someone executing a plan that had been prepared well in advance, she turned slightly to her left and introduced the young woman who had been standing just behind her. Grace Fuller was 24 years old and had arrived from Denver, Lavinia explained, for a visit of several weeks. She was Lavinia's niece on her mother's side. She was objectively lovely in the way that people are lovely when they have been raised in comfort, and maintained in it with a kind of polished ease in her bearing that spoke of a life that had not required the particular education of hardship. The timing of Grace Fuller's visit to Cedar Ridge, arriving within 2 weeks of Violet's appearance at the station, was a coincidence that required either extraordinary credulity or no examination at all to accept. Violet accepted it with the perfect composure of a woman who had read the situation from the moment Lavinia appeared in the doorway and had already decided how she intended to conduct herself within it. That evening at the supper party, Lavinia Marsh hosted with the generosity of a woman who understood that generosity is sometimes the most efficient weapon available. The table was arranged so that Grace Fuller sat to Caleb's left. Violet noticed this in the way she noticed most arrangements of space and intent, cataloged it, and set it aside in favor of the more immediate business of the evening, which was to be exactly who she was without performance or apology. The moment came when Lavinia had drawn Caleb and Broderick into a conversation at the far end of the room about a proposed road improvement, and Sterling had stepped outside with the quiet, purposeful air of a man who prefers his own company to Lavinia Marsh's in every circumstance, and Violet found herself briefly adjacent to Grace Fuller with the particular intimacy of two women who have been left alone in a room by the same arrangement. Grace said in the sincere tone of someone who has been rehearsed in sincerity, "You must find it terribly hard being so far from Albany, from civilization and everything familiar. Mr. Caleb must have a great deal of patience." Violet looked at her for a moment, not unkindly. Grace Fuller was not a bad person. She was simply a tool that Lavinia Marsh was using competently, and tools are rarely responsible for the purposes they are put to. She said, "I find I've adapted faster than I expected. Mountain country is more direct than city country. It says what it means, and you know where you stand. I find that easier, not harder." She paused for exactly one beat. "I've always found that environments which require honesty suit me better than environments which require the management of appearances." Grace blinked. Lavinia, who had positioned herself within hearing distance with the skill of a woman who has been doing this for 2 decades, went very still in the way that people go still when they understand that a conversation has not gone the direction they planned. On the ride home, the four of them moved down the valley road in the cold, clear dark, with the stars overhead in that particular Montana abundance that Violet had not yet grown accustomed to and suspected she never would. Broderick fell back slightly in the pace of his horse and came level with her. "You knew what that was from the moment we walked in," he said. "I knew what it was before we walked in," she said. "You don't stage a visit from Denver on a week's notice without a plan." He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his version of respect, which was warmer than most people's versions. "Does it bother you?" "No," she said. And it was true. "The ground I'm standing on is real. What Mrs. Marsh thinks of the view doesn't change what the ground is. Broderick nodded and fell back to let her ride ahead. When they reached the gate of the station, Caleb dismounted and held her horse while she stepped down, which he did with the same unhurried practicality he brought to everything, as if it required no acknowledgement. But when she had her footing and he had let go of the bridle, he paused for just a moment. "Are you all right?" he said, not with the inflection of a question, with the directness of a man who wants a real answer. "Completely," she said. He nodded once and went to the barn with the horses. She went inside where Winifred had left the kitchen warm and a covered plate on the back of the stove. It was not until she was sitting alone at the table that she understood what had been different about that question. In 3 weeks at Cedar Ridge Station, she had been asked practical questions, ranch questions, logistical questions about livestock, and channels and supply ledgers. That had been the first time Caleb Harlow had asked her about her interior condition. The first time he had asked about her rather than about the work. She did not make a great thing of it, but she lay in the dark for a while before sleeping and turned the question over once carefully like a stone that might have something worth knowing under it. Then the blizzard came. It announced itself with a sky that changed color in the northwest on the 25th afternoon, moving from the thin blue of a cold October day into the gray that held no light of its own, just a flat opacity that the old hands at the station called the sign of real weather. Violet had been watching it since 2 in the afternoon. She watched the way the clouds moved, the speed and the density, the direction of the change. She had read about Montana weather systems in the geographic survey she had borrowed from the public lending library on Jefferson Street 2 years before she ever came to this place. And what she was reading in the sky above the ranch was consistent with what the survey had described as a continental front dropping from the northern ranges. She found Broderick at the fence line at 2:30. "There is a serious storm coming," she said. "It will be here before dark." He looked at the sky with the assessing squint of a man who has spent 15 years reading Montana weather. "This time of year, the sky moves like that all the time. It usually breaks up on the eastern ridge." "Not today," she said. He was not dismissive exactly. He was a man who trusted experience over theory, which was a reasonable position to take in a place like this, and his experience did not yet include watching Violet Whitmore read weather. He went back to the fence. By 5 o'clock, the leading edge of the storm had come over the western ridge, and the temperature had dropped 12 degrees in 40 minutes, and the first snow was not falling so much as moving horizontally at a velocity that made the word falling insufficient. 3 of the hands, Harlan Briggs, and 2 younger men named Colquhoun and Tate, were in the eastern pasture with 20 head of cattle and no line of sight to the main buildings. Caleb had his coat on before anyone said anything to him. Violet was already at the door. She was wearing the heavy coat that had been her grandmother's, the one she had packed over her mother's objections, and she had the rope coiled over her left shoulder and the heavy leather work gloves Sterling had given her after the first week's fence work, and she was standing at the door in a posture that was not requesting permission. Caleb looked at her. She said, "You will go in circles. I walk the eastern pasture every morning for 3 weeks. I know every landmark between here and the creek junction. You need me." He looked at her for a moment that was not hesitation, but calculation. The same calculation he applied to any resource the ranch had, and the question of whether it was being deployed correctly. 3 steps, he said. "Never more than 3 steps from me. You stop when I stop, and you move when I move. Understood?" "Understood." Sterling was at the wall behind her. She had not heard him come in. He stood with his arms at his sides in the particular stillness of a man who has already processed a situation and arrived at a conclusion he does not like but cannot argue with. His face was composed in the way of someone keeping something compressed. Broderick came to stand beside him. He put his hand on his younger brother's shoulder and left it there. The two of them watched Caleb and Violet walk out into the white. What happened in the storm was not heroic in any cinematic sense. It was cold and blind and entirely unglamorous. Caleb moved ahead and broke a path through drifts that were already thigh-high in the low ground, using his body as a plow and the rope between them as a lifeline. Violet navigated. She counted paces from the gate post, a number she had arrived at by walking the route 3 times in calm weather and averaging the results. She tracked the angle of the wind against her left cheek, which told her the direction to the tree line she could no longer see. She knew the ground rose slightly at 200 paces from the main gate and fell away sharply at 300, and that the creek junction was 50 paces east of the first fall. And she called these things into the wind as they needed to be called, and Caleb corrected their heading without discussion. They found the 3 men and the cattle in a hollow below the creek bank, where Harlan Briggs had been canny enough to push the herd when the storm hit, using the bank as a windbreak. Harlan himself was in trouble. His right hand, which he had used to clear ice from the lead steer's halter, had been bare for 20 minutes in the driving cold and had gone from painful to numb to the particular waxy pallor that Violet recognized from the medical reference volume she had memorized on Jefferson Street. She did not hesitate, and she did not panic, and she did not ask for instruction. She kept the hand close to Harlan's body under his coat, not warmed rapidly, but protected and held at a temperature that allowed the tissue to recover gradually rather than through the shock of sudden heat, which the book had been clear was worse than the cold itself. She explained calmly and precisely exactly what she was doing and why, and Harlan, who was a man not accustomed to being treated by anyone who explained their reasoning to him, listened with the careful attention of someone whose hand was at stake. They brought everyone back. The cattle were driven through drifts that had no right to be traversable, and were traversable because there was no alternative. Cocoon took a fall near the gate post, and Violet caught his arm on the rope and kept him up. Tate, the youngest of the 3, was crying from cold and from fear, and not doing anything to hide it, and she said nothing about this except to tell him he was doing well, and to keep moving, which was both true and the only thing that needed to be said. The door of the station house closed behind all 6 of them at 10 minutes past 7. Sterling opened it. He had been standing there, not waiting in the sentimental sense, but occupying the position from which he would be able to act immediately on whatever came through the door, which was how Sterling Harlow expressed concern. He looked at Caleb first, a rapid assessment, found what he was looking for, and looked away. Then he looked at Violet, at her hands, which were red and cold, but uninjured, at her face, which was windburned and exhausted and entirely intact. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and took out the pair of heavy leather gloves he had been keeping there warm from his body and set them in her hands. Then he turned away and went to the stove to get more wood and said nothing further. Broderick was already pouring hot water. Winifred had the stove burning high and a pot of beef broth working in the specific, efficient composure of a woman who had been keeping herself occupied in the absence of things she could control and was now gratefully returned to things she could. Violet sat with Harlan Briggs beside the fire for the better part of an hour, monitoring his hand, keeping him warm, watching the color return in the incremental way that was the correct way for it to return rather than the fast way that would have been dangerous. Caleb sat nearby. He did not say anything for a long time. He simply stayed in the room, which meant something. When Harlan's hand had returned to itself and the man had eaten, and the 2 younger hands had dried out and been fed and sent to their bunks, and the house had gone quiet with the particular quiet of a place that has survived something, Caleb spoke. He said, "You saved 3 people tonight, counting me." She looked at him across the room. "You would have found them." "Not Harlan's hand," he said. "I wouldn't have known what to do with the hand." This was true, and she knew it was true, and there was nothing in his saying it that was diminishment or reluctant acknowledgement. It was simply accurate, offered with the directness of a man who does not soften true things into smaller shapes. She said, "You kept us from losing each other in the whiteout. I could navigate, but I couldn't have broken that kind of ground alone." He looked at her for a moment longer. "No," he said, "you couldn't, and I couldn't have navigated." He set his cup down. "That is what I mean." The fire had burned low by the time everyone else had gone to bed, and it was only the 2 of them at the kitchen table. The storm had stripped something away, the way storms do, taken the ordinary surface off things and left what was underneath exposed to the air. Caleb spoke first. He spoke about his father. Not the way Broderick spoke about him, with the ease of stories carried long enough to lose their weight. He spoke the way a man speaks about something he has been carrying close and has not often set down. He said that when his father died in the late autumn of 1857, the fever had taken both his parents inside of 2 weeks, and the ground was already too hard for proper burial. He had been 19 years old, and Broderick had been 15, and Sterling 12, and there was no one within a day's ride who was close enough to be called family, and no money to speak of, and a single deed to a piece of land that was mostly rock and pine at an elevation where the winters came hard. He said there had been nights that first winter when he had gone out to the barn alone after his brothers were asleep and sat in the cold beside the horses and asked the darkness whether what he was doing was the right thing, whether staying was right, whether holding on was right, or whether holding on was just the only option that didn't require him to admit defeat, and whether there was a meaningful difference between those two things. The darkness had not answered. The mountain had not answered. But it had not left either, and he had come to understand over the course of 17 years that the mountain's version of an answer was its continued presence. It was there when he went out, and it was there when he came back, and it would be there in the morning. He had tried to be the same kind of thing for his brothers. He was not certain he had always succeeded. Violet listened to all of this without moving, the way she listened to things she understood were being said for the first time in a long while, if they had ever been said at all. She said, "You never allowed yourself to stop. There was no one else to do it." She looked at his hands where they rested on the table, the hands that had built this place from a broke-down cabin in a dead man's deed. She said, "There is now." The silence that followed was not empty. It held the weight of something that had been building for 25 days and had found on this particular night, after this particular storm, a surface to rest on. Caleb's hand moved across the table and settled over hers lightly, without pressure or demand. Simply present the way the mountain was present, simply there. Then he stood and said goodnight and went down the hall to the room he had been sleeping in since her arrival, and she heard his door close. She sat at the table a while longer. The fire was ash and coals now giving off a low red heat. Outside, the storm had exhausted itself, and the night was very still in the particular way of Montana nights when the wind has finally gone somewhere else. Her grandmother's voice came to her clearly the way it always did when she reached for the locket. "Winter always ends." She sat with that for a moment. Then she went upstairs to bed. 20 days after the blizzard, on a cold morning in November, a hired coach came down the approach road from the depot. She was in the garden when she heard it pulling the last of the frost-killed squash vines from the beds to be turned under before the ground froze solid. She straightened and saw the vehicle, an ordinary hired coach, of the kind that served the depot run from the rail station, and something moved through her that was not exactly dread, but was the particular alertness of a person who recognizes before they know why that something significant is arriving. George Whitmore stepped down from the coach. He was wearing his traveling coat, a wool thing she recognized from every winter of her childhood, and it was wrinkled from the train journey in a way that the George Whitmore she remembered would not have permitted. His shoulders were not the shoulders she remembered. They had been shoulders that carried the forward lean of a man engaged with the world moving toward his next transaction. These were shoulders that were being carried the way a weight is carried when the carrier has been walking too long. She wiped her hands on her work apron and went around the side of the house to the front. The three brothers were on the porch. Caleb had come forward to the top of the steps. Broderick stood at the edge of the porch, watchful and quiet. Sterling had taken up a position at the porch column nearest the door, arms folded with the stance of a man who has placed himself where he can be useful if the situation requires it. Caleb moved to stand beside Violet when she came around the corner. Not in front of her, beside her. She noticed this the way she noticed the precise things, the things that told the actual truth about a situation. George Whitmore stood in the yard and removed his hat which he held in both hands in the manner of a man who is managing his own composure. He looked at Caleb more than at Violet, which she recognized immediately as a form of erasure, addressing the person in the room who had institutional authority rather than the person the conversation was actually about. He explained his situation in the careful language of a man presenting a case rather than making a confession. His commercial interests had contracted significantly. Certain arrangements he had entered into with a land agent in this territory, a man named Marsh, had not resolved as anticipated. There were creditors in Albany with legitimate claims and insufficient funds to satisfy them. The house on Elm Street was in danger. He was not asking for charity, he said. He was asking for a word spoken in the right ear, a letter of introduction, the kind of support that a man of Caleb Harlow's standing in the territory could extend to a man in difficulty without any great cost to himself. He said finally, "She is still my daughter after all." Violet spoke before Caleb could. She did not raise her voice. The composure in her was the particular kind that comes after a long time of pain has been processed, not suppressed, and the processing has left a person cleaner on the other side. "Father, a man who loves his daughter does not send her away in the language of relief. You did not send me here. You disposed of me here. There is a difference, and you know there is." She looked at him with eyes that held no anger because the anger had been done a long time ago. "You came here because you need something, not because you needed to see me. I understand that, but I do not owe you this. I do not owe you anything that was purchased at the cost of making me feel for 22 years like a problem to be managed." George opened his mouth. Caleb spoke. His voice was quiet and it was final. The voice of a man who does not need volume because he has never needed it. "Mr. Whitmore, my wife has said what needs to be said." The word wife landed in the yard between them like a stone dropped from height, settling into the earth and staying there. Sterling at the porch column said nothing. He did not need to. The way he was standing said everything that needed to be said about whether George Whitmore would find the encounter navigable from any direction he chose to try. George stood in the yard for a moment longer with his hat in his hands. He was a man who had arrived with a plan and found the plan inapplicable, and there was nothing left to do with that except leave, which he did. He climbed back into the hired coach without slamming the door, which she thought was perhaps the most honest thing she had seen him do in 22 years. Slamming the door would have been performance. Not slamming it was just a man who was tired. The coach started down the road. And then before it had gone 20 yards, George Whitmore turned and looked back through the window. It was a single look. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she saw something in her father's face that she had never seen directed at her in 22 years of living in the same house as him. A true seeing. Not assessment, not calculation, not the managed consideration of a problem. Just a man looking at his daughter and understanding, perhaps for the first time and too late to be useful, what he had been looking at all along. The coach went around the bend in the road and was gone. She stood in the yard a while after it disappeared. Sterling came off the porch and stood beside her, not close enough to be intrusive, but present in the way that he had learned to be present, which was specific and reliable and asking nothing. He said, "You were right. You don't owe him anything." She said, "I know." He said, "You didn't shake." She said, "I finished shaking a long time ago." He was quiet for a moment. The mountain was behind them and the valley was below, and the afternoon was very cold and very clear. Then Sterling said to the middle distance in front of him in a tone that was the most unguarded she had ever heard from him, "When Caleb asks you, say yes. He needs someone like you. I didn't think so when you arrived. I was wrong." He went back inside before she could answer. She stood alone in the yard and let the afternoon settle around her, the cold and the clarity of it, and she held what Sterling had said, the way you hold something you did not expect to be given and are not yet certain how to put down. 3 days before the wedding, the notice arrived from the Territorial Land Office. Caleb read it at the breakfast table, and the color went out of his face in the specific way of a man receiving bad news he had not anticipated. He held the document for a long moment without speaking. Cornelius Marsh had filed a boundary dispute claim against the eastern section of Cedar Ridge Station. The claim, if upheld, would terminate the ranch's legal access to the water rights along the eastern creek. Without those rights, the eastern pasture could not be managed through the dry summer months, which meant the herd could not be expanded as planned, which meant the growth that 17 years of work had been building toward was blocked by a single piece of paper filed in the Territorial Land Office. Broderick read the document over Caleb's shoulder and looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at the table. Violet was quiet for a moment. She stood up. She went upstairs to her room and opened the trunk at the foot of her bed and took out a flat leather case that was not her notebook, not the one she used for daily observations, but a thinner one that she had filled over the preceding 2 months with copied documents and her own careful summaries of the land records held in the Cedar Ridge Station files. She had been reading the ranch's historical documents because they were there and because she found the history of a place's legal construction interesting in the same way she found the geography of a place interesting as the record of decisions made under constraint that told you more about who made them than any number of personal accounts. She had not been doing it for any strategic purpose. She had simply been doing what she did, which was to look carefully at what was in front of her and record what she found. 2 months ago, she had found the 1858 water rights easement. It was a document recorded at the Territorial Land Office in the first year of the ranch's formal establishment, a legal instrument that predated Cornelius Marsh's present claim by 16 years and established in clear and unambiguous language the perpetual water access rights of the Cedar Ridge Station property and its lawful successors. She had found it interesting. She had copied it into her case. She had requested 2 weeks later from the Territorial Survey Office a copy of the relevant boundary survey on the grounds of historical curiosity, and they had sent one, and she had placed that in the case as well. She had not told anyone about these documents because at the time there had been no reason to tell anyone. She had simply continued to know they existed the way she continued to know most things she had recorded with the patient. Unremarkable certainty of someone who has learned that the things you know quietly are very often the things that matter later. She went to the land office in the town of Cedar Ridge the following morning, alone riding the horse that Sterling had been teaching her to handle these past weeks. She carried the original 1858 easement document, her copy of it, the territorial survey map, and the patience of a woman who has done her preparation and knows what she is walking into. Cornelius Marsh was in his office. He was a man of 45 with the build of someone who had been physically capable once and had let that capability soften into authority, and he had the manner of a man accustomed to being the most informed person in any given conversation about land. She laid the documents on his desk one at a time, in order as she would lay out a case because that was what it was. She spoke quietly. She was not angry, and she was not intimidated, and she was not performing either of those states. She explained each document as she placed it what it was and what it established with the specificity of someone who has read the relevant law and understood it. The 1858 easement predated his claim by 16 years. It had been properly recorded. It was a matter of public record. Its existence made his present claim not merely contestable, but legally untenable from any position he might choose to occupy. She said that she assumed this had been an oversight because the alternative interpretation would reflect poorly on his professional standing in the territory, and she was certain he would not wish to create that impression. She placed the survey map last. Cornelius Marsh looked at the documents on his desk. He looked at the woman sitting across from him. She thought the expression of a man calculating how far a situation had traveled from the point where it was still manageable. The boundary dispute claim was withdrawn before the end of that afternoon. Caleb found out from Broderick that evening. She was in the kitchen mending a split in the sleeve of one of Caleb's work shirts, sitting at the table with the needle and thread and the practical calm of someone engaged in a useful task. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "You knew about the 1858 document," he said. "I found it in the historical records 2 months ago. You kept it. I thought it might be useful, she said. I didn't know when. He looked at her with an expression that she had seen building over the preceding weeks in various forms, and which had never quite arrived at whatever it was becoming until this moment. It was not surprise exactly. It was the expression of a man who has suspected for some time that the thing in front of us is extraordinary and has just received final confirmation. Violet Whitmore, he said, what else are you keeping? She looked up from the mending. The lamplight was warm in the kitchen. The stove was burning clean. The house around them was full of the particular settled quality of a place that has been through hard weather and come out intact. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had built a ranch from a 19-year-old's desperation and his dead father's deed. This man who had stood beside her in a yard and called her his wife without being asked. This man who had looked at a list she made at 5 in the morning and gone to get the copper pipe. She said, I suppose you'll have to find out. On the porch that evening in the last light of a November day, with the valley below them settling into its pre-winter quiet, Caleb stood beside her at the rail and looked out over everything they could see of Cedar Ridge Station, the fields and the creek and the mountains, in the particular light that came off the snow on the upper ridges at this hour. He said, I want to ask you something, and I want a real answer, not a careful one. All right, will you marry me? Not because of the arrangement we made in October, not because you came this far and it would be convenient, because I want you to. Because I would have chosen you regardless of any letter or registry or circumstance. I want you to know that it is a choice, my choice, freely made. She looked at the valley. She let herself stand in the fullness of the question for a moment which it deserved. She thought about the parlor in Albany and the sound of laughter that had cracked something in her chest in the hallway. She thought about her grandmother's hands pressing a locket into hers. She thought about 12 days on a train in the dark outside a window and asking for nothing except the chance to prove what she was. She thought about a water channel and a notebook and a copper pipe about a blizzard and a rope, and a man who broke trail through drifts because there was no other way, about a letter from Constance put into a stove and never spoken of again, about Sterling saying 4 words to a fire and 6 words in a yard about Broderick's stories of fence posts and nails pulled in the cold. She thought about the mountain that was always there when you came back and asked nothing in return. She turned and looked at Caleb Harlow. Yes, she said, I choose you, specifically you, not the arrangement and not the registry and not the circumstance. You. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, good. It was not a romantic word. It was a Caleb Harlow word, weighted the way he weighted all his words with the full measure of what he meant. She understood it completely. The evening came down around them, and the mountains went dark against the sky, and the house behind them was warm with lamplight, and the smell of wood smoke and Cedar Ridge Station settled into the particular quiet of a place that has found what it was always working toward and does not need to be told. The wedding was held on a Saturday morning in the second week of June 1875 in the small white church at the eastern end of Cedar Ridge's Main Street, the one whose whitewash had smelled of lime when Violet first saw it in October, and which had since been repainted and looked in the June light like a thing that had decided to take itself seriously. The building was full, not with the polite attendance of people who come to weddings out of obligation, but with the particular fullness of a community that has watched something develop over 8 months and wants to be present when it resolves. Ranch hands from Cedar Ridge Station sat alongside families from neighboring spreads, men who had ridden an hour each way on a working morning because they had decided the occasion was worth it. The provisioner from Hargrove's General Provisions sat 3 rows back and had brought his wife, which he had apparently not done for any public occasion in 4 years. The circuit preacher who had first mentioned the matrimonial registry to Caleb was present, having arranged his circuit to pass through Cedar Ridge on this specific date, which was either coincidence or the preacher's version of making amends. Winifred Alcott sat in the front pew. She was wearing her best dress, which she had not worn in a very long time, and her back was as straight as the day she had first walked into Cedar Ridge Station 6 years ago. She did not cry. But when Sterling, standing at the front with his brothers, glanced back at her once during the ceremony, she looked away and became very interested in the grain of the wooden pew in front of her. The family from Albany had sent a letter. It arrived 3 days before the ceremony, addressed to Violet in her father's handwriting, formal and brief, signed by George and Harriet and Constance. Dorothy's name was not among the signatures. Violet read it in her room the morning it arrived. She read it once completely, and then she placed it in the flat leather case that held the 1858 water rights easement and the territorial survey map. Not in the stove. She did not need to burn it. It was simply a letter, and she was no longer afraid of letters from Albany. Broderick stood at the front of the church as best man, which he performed with the particular warmth of a man who has been hoping for this outcome since the day the wagon came down the approach road and has been patient enough not to say so. Sterling stood beside him. He was wearing his best clothes, which he had pressed himself the previous evening, without comment, and his face held the contained expression he brought to any serious occasion, the expression of a man who has appointed himself responsible for the correct conduct of events and intends to see that responsibility through. When Violet came through the door in the dress Winifred had spent 3 evenings altering to fit her properly, a simple cream thing that had belonged to her grandmother, and which had the ivory warmth of old fabric worn by someone who had known how to wear things, the silver locket at her throat, and a small arrangement of early summer wildflowers braided into her hair that Winifred had insisted upon despite Violet's initial resistance. Sterling looked at her, and something shifted in the careful composition of his face. It lasted only a moment. Then he looked at the wall behind the preacher, and his expression was composed again. But the moment had been real. Caleb stood at the front of the church and watched his future wife walk toward him down the center aisle of a small Montana church on a June morning, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has carried a particular weight for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. He had built this ranch from nothing. He had held it through 17 winters. He had made every hard decision alone and paid every cost alone, and had never once complained about the solitude of it, because solitude was the price and the ranch was worth the price, and that was simply the arithmetic of the life he had chosen. But he was 36 years old, and he was tired of being alone, and he had known it for years before he had been willing to put that knowledge into words. And now she was walking toward him with calloused hands and a straight spine and a leather case in her trunk that held the document that had protected his land when he had not known to protect it himself, and the tiredness was lifting off him like morning fog off the creek, and he breathed in the morning air of the best day he had had in a very long time. The vows were short. He promised to hear her, to trust her judgment as he trusted his own, to stand beside her rather than in front of her. She promised to build with him honestly and with full effort, and to tell him the truth even when it was inconvenient, which he said was the part he was most counting on. There was a brief sound from the pews that might have been laughter. After the ceremony in the churchyard, and then at the table that had been set up outside the station for the celebration that followed the afternoon, had the particular quality of a day that is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Children ran through the lower pasture. The hands from the ranch, cleaned up and awkward in their best clothes, moved through the gathering with the careful good behavior of men who are genuinely pleased and are not sure how to express it. The preacher made a toast that was rather long, but meant well. Broderick made a toast that was shorter and considerably more effective. Sterling did not make a toast, but late in the afternoon, when the celebration had settled into its comfortable latter stage and people were sitting in small groups watching the light change on the mountains, he came and stood beside Violet, where she was watching Caleb talk with 2 of the ranch hands about a fence repair that apparently could not wait even on the day of his wedding. He's going to spend the rest of his life talking about fence repairs at inconvenient times, Sterling said. I know, she said. That doesn't bother you. No, she said. I find it reassuring. A man who notices what needs fixing is a man who cares about the thing he's built. Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're home now. It was 3 words offered without ceremony in the same plain tone he used for everything else. But she understood that for Sterling Harlow, who rationed his words more carefully than any man she had ever known, those 3 words had cost him something real, and she received them accordingly. "I know," she said. "I am." The summer that followed was the best season Cedar Ridge Station had seen in years, and the autumn that came after it was a working autumn, full and purposeful, the kind of season that a ranch produces when it is being managed by people who understand each other. Violet's water system, the one she had been expanding and refining since the first morning she had walked the eastern pasture, turned out to be more significant than anyone had understood. The rerouting she had proposed in October, which Caleb had initially seen as a minor repair, proved to be the foundation of a broader improvement to the irrigation that doubled the effective growing area of the ranch's hayfields. The extra hay kept the herd in better condition through the following winter. The winter losses were the lowest the ranch had recorded. Caleb noticed these things in the precise and practical way he noticed everything. He did not comment on them in any excessive way. But one evening in late autumn, sitting at the table with the season's account spread between them, working through the numbers together in the comfortable silence they had established over the months of building this partnership, he looked up from the ledger and said, "You understand this land." She looked at him. "So do you." "Not the same way," he said. "You see things I stop seeing when I'm too close to them." She thought about the ring of dead grass in the eastern pasture, the one he had been looking at for years without seeing it. "You were carrying too much alone," she said. "Two pairs of eyes see more than one." "Yes," he said, "that was all." But the way he said it carried the weight of a man who has been working alone for 17 years and has just fully understood what that cost him and what it costs him no longer. The first winter was harder than any winter Violet had known in Albany, and she was grateful for every one of the agricultural pamphlets she had read and every note she had made in her notebook over the 2 years before she arrived. The cold came with a seriousness that the word cold does not adequately describe, the kind of cold that requires active management just to survive it, and she managed it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. She learned what the ranch needed in deep winter. She learned it by doing, and she learned it alongside Caleb and his brothers, and every lesson that came hard was a lesson that stuck. Sterling that winter began to change in a way that was slow enough that you only noticed it in the accumulation, in the way that winter ice changes when the temperature rises by single degrees, each degree too small to see, but the sum of them enough to alter the landscape entirely. He was not and would never be a man of easy warmth, but the particular quality of his watchfulness shifted. He was no longer watching for the moment she would leave. He had stopped watching for that somewhere between the blizzard and the morning she had come back from the land office, with Cornelius Marsh's claim withdrawn. Now he watched the way he watched the weather attentively and without particular expectations, simply noting what was there. In the spring, he taught her to ride properly, not the adequate horsemanship she had assembled from necessity over the months, but the real thing, the kind of riding that a person who is going to spend the rest of their life on mountain terrain needs to understand. He taught her with the same economy and directness he brought to everything. No flattery, no false encouragement, precise and fair corrections given at the moment they were needed. She was a good student, which he did not say, but she understood he thought so from the fact that the lessons continued longer and went further than strictly necessary. One afternoon in late spring, riding back along the ridge above the ranch with the valley spread below them and the mountains large and specific against the blue sky, Sterling said, "You'll need to know the North Ridge Trail before next winter. There's a section that looks passable, but isn't after the first heavy snow. 2 of the hands have made the mistake." She filed it. She noted it in her book. She asked him to show her the section. He did without comment on a morning 3 days later. That was the nature of their relationship, practical, direct, built from accumulated small acts of usefulness and reliability, and the mutual recognition that the other person could be counted on. It was not the warmth of Broderick, who expressed himself in stories and ease, and the particular gift of making whoever he was with feel genuinely heard. It was something sturdier than warmth, less comfortable, but more dependable, the kind of connection that is built rather than felt, and which holds precisely because it was built and not simply happened. Broderick, for his part, had settled into the role of the household's conversational heart in a way that became more explicit now that Violet was there to appreciate it. He was the one who told the stories, who kept the histories of the valley alive, who knew which neighbor had a good colt coming up for sale and which one needed help with a barn repair before the summer rains. He was the connective tissue of Cedar Ridge Station's relationship with the broader community of the valley, and he performed this function with the natural ease of a man who has found exactly the work he was made for. In the second autumn their son was born. He arrived in September during the harvest, and the timing, while inconvenient from a ranch management perspective, was what it was. And what it was sufficient to stop all ranch operations for 2 days without a complaint from anyone on the property. Caleb held his son with the hands that had split wood and driven cattle and built fences and repaired water channels and done every kind of work that the land had asked of them, and those hands in that moment shook. Not from weakness, from the particular kind of feeling that arrives at a juncture you have been working toward for 17 years and have not been certain you would reach. Broderick, outside the room, sat down in the hallway with his back against the wall and stayed there for a while. Sterling stood at the window of the hallway for a time, looking at the mountain. Then he went outside to the barn, as he sometimes did when the inside of a house became too full of something he was still learning how to carry. He was gone for perhaps an hour. When he came back in, his face was composed, and he went directly to the room where Violet was resting with the infant and stood in the doorway and looked at the child. He looked for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "He has your hands." Violet looked down at the small, sleeping face. "I hope so," she said. "They're good hands." Sterling nodded once and went to find Winifred to tell her the kitchen needed seeing, to which was his way of removing himself from a moment before it asked more of him than he had available, and which everyone in the household had come to understand as his version of being moved. The letters to Nell had continued every week throughout without exception. Violet had written them on Sunday evenings, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, filling the pages with the specific and practical details of ranch life that she knew her grandmother would want rather than sentimental summaries. She described the water system and the fence repairs and the quality of the hay harvest. She described Caleb's particular way of assessing a problem by walking around it rather than at it. She described Sterling teaching her to ride the North Ridge, and Broderick's collection of improbable frontier stories, and Winifred's apple cake, which was the best thing she had eaten in her life, and which she had been trying for a year to reproduce with approximately 80% success. She described the mountains in each season, each time differently, because they were different each time, and the differences were worth recording. She described her son. The letter she had written when he was 3 days old was the longest she had ever written. She filled 6 pages with the particular astonishment of a woman encountering a new form of love that she had known was theoretical and had not understood until it was actual. She described Caleb's hand shaking. She described the September light through the east window of the bedroom. She described holding this small person who was entirely new and entirely hers, and thinking about Elspeth crossing the Appalachians in 1810, and understanding in a way she had not quite understood before what that crossing had set in motion. Nell's reply to that letter arrived in November. It was shorter than usual, the handwriting less firm than it had been, which Violet noted and filed in the way she filed things that she needed to know, but was not yet ready to think about fully. The reply said, "I knew you would find it. I always knew you would find it. Now I can stop worrying." Nell died in the winter of 1878 on a February morning in the small lavender-smelling room at the back of the house on Elm Street. The letter from George Whitmore was formal and brief and arrived 6 days after the fact, which Violet thought was probably the best her father was capable of, and accepted as such. She sat on the porch of Cedar Ridge Station that evening and held the locket in both hands and looked at the mountains and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been lost. Not bitterly, not with the particular ache of grief that is mixed with regret, because there was no regret in this. The letters had arrived every week without exception. Nell had known. Nell had always known, and the knowing had been enough. Caleb came and sat beside her. He did not say anything. He had learned over the years of their marriage that Violet's silences were not silences that needed filling, that she was not a woman who required commentary on her emotional states, that what she sometimes needed was simply the specific presence of someone who was not going anywhere. He sat beside her until the mountains went dark and the night came in from the east, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and that was that. She wore the locket every day after. She had worn it every day before, but there was a difference now in how she wore it, a difference in the weight of what it carried. It was no longer primarily the talisman of a woman uncertain of her future. It was the inheritance of a woman who understood exactly where she had come from and exactly where she was, and who found those two things taken together entirely sufficient. The years moved in the way that years do when a life is full and purposeful, quickly in the aggregate and slowly in the particular, each season complete in itself, and the sum of them, a thing that surprises you when you stand back and look at it. The ranch grew, not dramatically, not in the way of men who gamble on scale, but steadily and deliberately in the way of a place that is being managed by people who understand the difference between growth and expansion, between building and accumulating. Violet's observation of the eastern pasture irrigation proved over years to be the foundation of an approach that changed how the ranch managed its water across all its land. Caleb extended the principle systematically, working from the notes she kept incorporating, his own accumulated knowledge of the terrain, and the result was a property that produced more consistently than anything comparable in the valley. In 1882, when Broderick Harlow finally stopped delaying and went to call on a widow in the neighboring valley named Harriet Prescott, a woman of 40 who had homesteaded alone for 3 years after her husband's death, and who had been observing Broderick's approach with considerable patience, Violet was the person he told first. He came into the kitchen at an hour that was not a mealtime, which was unusual for Broderick, and stood at the counter with his hat in his hands and said, "I'm going to ask Harriet Prescott if she would consider a conversation about her future plans." Violet set down the bread dough she was working. "Good," she said. "It's about time. She's been wondering what was taking you so long." Broderick stared at her. "You know her. I met her at the church social in April. We had a very interesting conversation about soil drainage in the North Valley. She's a capable woman with good judgment." "Did she—" Broderick stopped. He looked at his hat. "Did she say anything?" "She said the valley was a good place to build a life if you had the right kind of partner." Broderick put his hat on and went to see Harriet Prescott. They were married in the spring in the same small church where Caleb and Violet had married, and Violet watched Broderick Harlow walk toward his future wife with the expression of a man who has been hoping for something for so long that the arrival of it is almost more than he knows how to contain. And she thought about her own walk down that same aisle 8 years earlier and felt with the particular clarity that distance gives to memory the full shape of what she had walked toward. Sterling took longer. He was a man who moved toward the important things in his life, the way he moved through the mountains, deliberately testing the ground as he went, taking nothing on faith that he could take on evidence instead. He was 38 years old when he met a school teacher named Dorothea Vance, who had come to Cedar Ridge to take the position at the town school and who had the quality rare and immediately apparent of being completely unimpressed by the particular manner in which Sterling Harlow moved through a room. She was not unfriendly. She simply treated his edges as a given rather than a warning, which was an approach Sterling had never encountered from anyone who was not his brother, and it disoriented him sufficiently that he began finding reasons to ride past the school on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, which were the days Dorothea supervised the older children's outdoor activities. It took him the better part of 2 years to propose. Violet had been watching this development with considerable interest and had said nothing which was the correct approach with Sterling, in which she had learned from 5 years of knowing him. When he finally came to tell her and Caleb that he had asked Dorothea Vance to marry him and that she had said yes, Violet put down her coffee and said, "Good, now you'll have someone who will actually tell you when you're wrong." Sterling looked at her with the amber eyes that had once been calibrated entirely for threat detection, and which now held in the right light the particular warmth of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive and has stopped being surprised by it. She already does, he said. The years that followed were the years of building in the full sense not just the ranch, but the life of a valley community, the slow accumulation of shared history that makes a place into a home, not just for individuals, but for generations. Violet started the school that the children of the ranch hands attended in the old storage building she had converted with Sterling's practical assistance, and it eventually grew into a proper institution with a hired teacher in a dedicated building and a student body that drew from 3 neighboring ranches. She maintained the notebooks. She had been keeping them since 1874, one shelf of them now each year in its own volume, and they contain the accumulated observation of a woman who had spent her adult life paying attention to a particular piece of land and its particular community of people. The notebooks were not diaries in any emotional sense. They were records precise and practical of what had been planted and what had grown and what had failed and why, of what had been built and what had needed repair and what the repair had cost, of what the weather had done and what the land had done in response of the movements of cattle and the behavior of creek water and the particular patterns of frost in the east pasture across 30 years of careful observation. Caleb read them sometimes in the evenings. He read them the way he had always read things she produced, with complete seriousness and the occasional brief comment that meant he had found something useful. She had long ago stopped being surprised by the depth of his attention to what she offered. It was simply how he was. He had chosen her with the same deliberate seriousness he brought to every important decision, and he had not revised that choice in the 20 years since. She had not revised hers. Their son grew up with the particular combination of his father's physical capability and his mother's observational intelligence, which produced a young man who could read weather in the morning sky, in a pasture drainage pattern in the lay of the grass, in a situation in the faces of the people in it all, with the same easy competence that suggested he had been taught these things so early and so thoroughly that they had long since ceased to feel like skills and had become simply how he understood the world. There were grandchildren in time which arrived with the same particular astonishment that the first child had brought, but multiplied and distributed, filling the house and the yard and the lower pasture with a volume and variety of human noise that Cedar Ridge Station had never previously contained. Winifred Alcott, who had managed this kitchen for 32 years, retired on a Tuesday in the early autumn of 1906 at the age of 70 and moved to a small house in the town of Cedar Ridge that her daughter had been asking her to share for a decade. Her departure from the station was managed with the same economy of sentiment she had brought to everything else, a brief exchange in the kitchen on a morning that looked like every other morning, a handshake rather than an embrace, and a comment from Winifred as she picked up her bag that the bread recipe was in the tin on the second shelf and not to let anyone change the proportions. She was gone before noon. Violet stood in the kitchen after she left and looked at the room that Winifred Alcott had managed with unassailable competence for 3 decades and felt the specific weight of the absence in the way you feel the absence of things that have been present so long and so reliably that they have become part of the texture of your days. Then she put on her apron and started the bread because the proportions were in the tin and the dough needed starting by noon or supper would be late. And Cedar Ridge Station had not been a house that permitted late suppers for 32 years, and there was no reason to start now. It was 1914, 40 years. The number had a weight to it that she only fully felt when she held it still and looked at it, which she did not often do during the working day, because the working day did not permit it. But sometimes in the evening, sitting on the porch with Caleb, as the light moved off the mountains and the valley settled into its particular summer dusk, she would hold the number and feel what it contained. 40 years of mornings, 40 October frosts and 40 June mornings, and 40 winters that had come and each time ended. 40 harvests recorded in the notebooks on the shelf inside the door. 40 years of a particular person's particular hands on the railing beside her, the same hands that had built this porch and built the barn and repaired the fence and held an infant in September, with a barely containable terror of doing it wrong hands that were slower now, more deliberate in their movements, but no less capable of the essential task, which was simply to be there. Her granddaughter came up the porch steps in the late afternoon with the light-footed confidence of a child who has never been uncertain of her welcome. She was 10 years old and had the particular quality of children who have been raised in a place full enough of history and activity that curiosity is their natural state. She sat down beside Violet on the bench and looked at the valley the way children look at the things adults look at, trying to understand what the looking is for. "How did you get here, Grandma?" she asked. Violet looked at the valley. The lower pasture was green in the late summer way deep in particular. The creek was low in August, a bright line through the cottonwoods. The mountains were their usual selves, large and patient, and entirely unmoved by the question. "I got on a wagon in Albany, New York," she said, "with one trunk and a small notebook and a locket I'd never taken off since the morning my grandmother gave it to me." "Were you scared?" She considered this honestly. "Yes," she said, "but my grandmother told me that my great-great-grandmother had crossed the Appalachians alone at 18 years old without anyone's permission, and that she had gone and she had learned. So I decided to do the same." "And then what happened?" Violet looked at the valley. She looked at Caleb in his chair beside her. His eyes closed now in the late afternoon warmth, his breathing slow and even, his hand resting on the arm of the chair that was a few inches from hers in the particular proximity of two people who have been sitting beside each other for 40 years and no longer need to touch to be present to each other. She looked at the ranch, at the irrigated fields that had started with a water channel and a notebook and a copper pipe, and had grown into something that fed this valley through drought years and flood years and the ordinary hard years that were just the nature of the work. She looked at the storage building that was now a school. She looked at the road down to the town where Broderick and Harriet lived in the house they had built when his children were young, and Sterling and Dorothea, 3 miles south in the valley, Sterling had chosen because it had the best view of the North Ridge, and he had never entirely stopped wanting the best view available. She thought about a parlor in Albany and a tangle of laughter in the words their problem now. She thought about the warmth going out of a stack of laundered linens in the dark hallway of a house that had never been hers in any real sense. She thought about a wagon coming down a long road with the mountains large beyond it and 3 men on a porch who did not move or speak and the particular decision to walk toward them anyway. She thought about a man in a market in 1871 who had stood at the back of a crowd and watched a girl do something he had been too slow to do himself and had not forgotten her face for 3 years. She thought about that same man older now, reading a list she had made at 5 in the morning and going quietly to get the copper pipe. She thought about Sterling's amber eyes calibrated for threat, and then years later calibrated for weather, and years after that calibrated simply for what was there. She thought about Broderick's stories and the way he told them, the gift of a man who understood that a story told at the right moment can do more work than any other available tool. She thought about Winifred Alcott's apron set down on the corner of a work table without a word. She thought about winter always ending. She turned and looked at her granddaughter, who was watching her with the patient attention of a child who has learned that some answers take a moment to arrive, but are worth the waiting. "I found where I belonged," Violet said, "not where I was sent, where I belong. And I built it. We built it." She looked at Caleb still in his chair and at the valley beyond him. "You can't be sent to where you belong. You have to build your way there. But if you're willing to do the work, it's there to be built." The granddaughter considered this with the seriousness of 10. Then she climbed down from the bench and went back to her cousins in the lower pasture, and the sound of children faded toward the creek. Caleb opened his eyes. He had not been asleep. He almost never was on the evenings when they sat on this porch. He was simply resting in the particular way of a man who has nothing left to prove and has discovered that the absence of that particular pressure is one of the better conditions of a long life. He looked at his wife. She was 62 years old and her hair had gone silver at the temples and her hands were calloused in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's definition of ladylike, and everything to do with 40 years of work she had chosen and done well. She was looking at the valley with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything since the day she stepped off a wagon onto Montana soil and took the measure of what she was walking toward. He had been right about her. He had known he was right from the moment she stopped halfway across the yard in front of his house and told him plainly what she was and what she came with and what he should know before they went any further. He had known it more certainly with every day since. He had never once in 40 years had reason to revise the knowing. "What did you tell her?" he said. Violet looked at him. "That you can't be sent to where you belong. You have to build your way there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's right." It was a Caleb Harlow answer, direct and complete, weighted exactly as much as it needed to be weighted, and not one measure more. She had been receiving answers like this for 40 years, and she found them as satisfying now as she had found the first one standing in the yard at Cedar Ridge Station in the autumn of 1874, when he had looked at her list of disqualifications and said, "That is exactly the reason I wrote to Albany." The evening came down over the valley in the particular way of Montana summer evenings, slowly and generously, the light lasting longer than it had any right to. The mountains were their usual selves, indifferent to the passage of time, in the way that things which predate all human concern are indifferent to it, neither hostile nor welcoming, simply there, permanently and reliably there. Violet reached out and rested her hand over Caleb's where it lay on the arm of his chair. He turned his hand and held hers the way he had held it across a kitchen table on a night after a blizzard 40 years ago, lightly and without pressure and simply present. Below them in the lower pasture, the voices of children moved through the summer air. Her family had sent her away thinking they were disposing of a problem. They had put her on a train and pointed her west and washed their hands of her in the language of relief. And they had not known, could not have known, that what they were disposing of was not a problem at all, but a woman who had spent 22 years learning how to see and how to think and how to work and how to stand in a difficult moment without flinching, and that what they were pointing her toward was a place that needed exactly those things and a man who had been waiting 3 years to offer them a home. She had arrived not knowing any of that. She had arrived with a trunk and a notebook and a silver locket and the plain intention to be useful, and she had been. And the life that had grown from that intention was the life around her now, as real and specific and permanent as the mountains behind the house. The last light went off the peaks. The valley settled into its evening blue. Violet Harlow held her husband's hand and watched the dark come in from the east, and she was home, as she had been home for 40 years, as she would be home for however many years remained in the place she had not been sent to, but had built her way into, which was the only kind of belonging that had ever been worth having.